Hey folks, David Stewart here. So how do you know if something is the best? How do you know you're watching the best movie, listening to the best album, thinking of the best way to accomplish a particular task? Well, it's not critics, it's not popularity, it's not sales, it's not how many awards something gets, it's not how many citations a person has, it's not how many times a concept is taught in class. It's actually all of those things plus time. So time is the real judge of pretty much everything. I'm talking mostly from an artistic perspective because that's primarily what I talk about on the channel, but you could apply this to philosophy, tradition, doctrine, way of life, a million different things. The real judge is time. I've talked about this in some other videos about the perception that music is worse now than it used to be. And so people ask the question, like, where is today's Mozart? There's no Mozart today. Well, we actually won't be fit to judge who today's Mozart is or compare anyone from today to Mozart until another 200 years has gone by, because time is a highly efficient and extremely effective filtering device. It removes from the collective consciousness anything that's not of the highest quality. And if you ask any person, even a well-educated musician, you ask them to start naming classical composers, and somebody who's really into music history and really into classical period literature, of course I'm talking about from about 1750 to about 1810, they'll start naming composers, and then they're going to run out of steam. Even if they're very knowledgeable, they probably won't be able to name more than 10 or 20 different composers. And there were hundreds, thousands of composers from the classical period. But we end up eliminating almost all of them except Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. And we end up talking about the three big German guys from the classical period. And the reason for that is because over time, you have continued criticism, you have continued analysis, you have each generation being retaught the same pieces of music, and it just gets distilled down until you're looking at three big personalities from this 60, 70 year stretch of time that people tend to call the classical period. All of that time gets condensed down to three people and their works, and even within those works, only a small selection of those ends up getting played. Haydn wrote over 100 symphonies, Mozart wrote over 40, Beethoven wrote only 9, and if you look at all of them, the 9 that get played the most are Beethoven's. And even within those 9, there's only probably 3 that get heard a lot. Probably like 4, 5, and 9 are the ones that people play the most. Sometimes 3, sometimes 7. But you rarely hear 1, you rarely hear 6, you rarely hear 8, right? So it even becomes a smaller number of those 9 symphonies. Most people don't listen to every piano sonata Beethoven did, but a select few of them. Same thing with the string quartets. And it's the same thing with Mozart symphonies. You listen to 3 or 4 of his most popular symphonies. Of course, he wrote extremely popular operas, but even then, it's probably only 3 or 4 of his operas that get any kind of rotation. And if you keep narrowing it down, it's like, well, everyone's heard Marriage of Figaro. So that ends up kind of being the opera that you listen to from Mozart. And of course he did others. He did Magic Flute. He did all these great operas. But even then, you're still just talking about one guy, and there were other operas being written in Italy and France and all kinds of other places. But anyway, time has filtered those down. So it's not fair to look at today's music where you're looking at thousands of artists and to say, how does that compare to Mozart? Well, because you haven't had 200 years of filtering to help you figure that out. That's why music of the past seems better than music of the present, is because we've done this filtering. We've gone from a huge selection down to a few important selections that people talk about. Even going back about 30 years to the 80s, people are still listening to the Thriller album. People are still listening to Michael Jackson's music. So chances are in another 30 years, you're going to still hear people at least talking about some Michael Jackson music, maybe a smaller selection. Maybe it'll get filtered down even tighter. But if you're still talking about something from the 80s, that's a good chance that people are going to continue talking about it and continue teaching it and continue learning it and continue listening to it into the future. People still listen to Birth of the Cool, which I think came out in 1939 or 1949. I'm trying to remember the year for Birth of the Cool. Miles Davis's Birth of the Cool. That was the beginning of cool jazz. There's lots of records that came out around the same time in the same genre that people just don't remember and don't listen to. It becomes just that one. That one gets kind of distilled down. Giant Steps. Everyone has Giant Steps. Rarely do people collect everything Coltrane has recorded. Of course I did. But if you ask me which album should you buy from John Coltrane, it's probably Giant Steps. And I think the same thing when I think about other albums too. And people ask me, what are your favorite, what do you think are the best metal albums? And I'm not far enough in the future from heavy metal to tell you what the best ones are. I can tell you my favorites. But even then, I'm hesitant to put certain things on the list. And I'll do a video where I'll give you like my top 20 or top 50 metal albums. I don't know. It's got to be more than 10, because 10 is just not enough. Maybe in 200 years, if you talk to my spirit, I could tell you the 10 best, because the time will have filtered it. But you won't have to ask me. There'll be 10 important metal albums that are the canon of heavy metal in 200 years that you could listen to, and people might sit around in some college class and listen to them and be like, well, this is what heavy metal was really about in the late 1900s and early 2000s. So I can tell you my favorites, but I'm hesitant to put anything on my lists that's really new, because it hasn't had enough time to sit with me and to be repeated and repeated and to stick. The things that I can definitely put on like my favorite metal albums list, or great metal albums list even, are the albums that I have listened to for more than 10 years. I know for sure that those albums stick around with me, that they're my favorites. Somebody remarked on a video I made quite a while ago. I just gave 5 of my favorite movies. He said they're all over 20 years old. I never stopped to think about that, but 20 years is long enough for a movie to sit and remain with you and be thought of as a really good movie. The fact that people still watch Star Wars, which came out in 1977, and it did not win Best Picture in 1977. I'm trying to remember what did, and it's slipping my mind right now. You'll write it down in the comments. I know it was, I don't remember it right now, so forgive me. But that one, Star Wars didn't win Best Picture, but I can't even remember the name of the movie that won Best Picture in 1977. So this is another indicator that time is the real judge, not the Academy Awards, not even ticket sales, because a huge box office success in 1985 may be forgotten by 2005. Who knows? It's the things that continue being watched. Highlander was a box office bomb, but time has judged it to be a good movie because people continue to watch it. Right to today, people are still watching Highlander and they're still making sequels. So if you're looking at time as the judge, Highlander is actually a pretty good movie. And you can say the same thing about lots of movies that people still remember from the past. People still watch Wizard of Oz. People still watch Gone with the Wind. Now, those were successful movies when they came out, but the judging of time has allowed them to remain, where other successful movies back from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, we don't talk about, we don't watch, we don't think about, we don't view as part of the essential Western canon of what we're doing. So that's part of this filtering of time. And just as another really great example from music is Bach. Bach is the composer. And the more you go further in time, and I've been doing music now for like 20 some odd years or something, and I've been doing academic music for almost 20 years at this point too. Bach has only gained in popularity over the last 20 years. And you talk to guys who are older than me, they're like in their 60s and they've been doing it for, 3 times as long. And they're like, yeah, Bach continues to get more popular. And sometimes it fades, and you have everybody's playing a select number of Bach pieces, and those become unpopular, and different Bach pieces become popular for a few years. But everybody's always playing Bach. And if you go to a bunch of music schools, even on guitar, which Bach wrote no music for guitar, and most of his music fits rather poorly on the instrument because it wasn't an instrument he interacted with. He wrote most of his solo suites for cello, violin, instruments that are tuned in fifths, not tuned in fourths like a guitar. Or he wrote for lute, and Baroque lute is tuned. You can actually see one behind me. So there's a Baroque lute back there. It has 24 strings, and it's tuned very different from a guitar. So he didn't write for guitar, but you still are required to play Bach on the guitar because it's considered he's the composer. It's completely essential for understanding Western music. When Bach was alive, he was not considered a great composer. He was considered a great keyboardist, a virtuoso organist, a great player of the harpsichord, a good violinist. In fact, he was regarded as a good musician. He was in charge of the churches at Leipzig and wrote music for them, 5 churches, I believe. And so that was a pretty prestigious position, but I don't think he was the first person on the list for that. And during his lifetime, he was considered at best a minor composer. But what's the real judge? The real judge is time. And all the people who considered him a lesser composer than a bunch of other German contemporaries or even English and Italian contemporaries, all those people have been forgotten, and it gets distilled down to Bach. And just like the classical period, you ask people who are the great Baroque composers, they'll probably list Vivaldi. They'll start with Bach. They'll go Bach, of course, Bach, right? We have to start with Bach and Handel, Vivaldi, Monteverdi. You start Robert de Vizier. You start listing composers, but Bach is almost always the first one on the list. And if you go 300 years into the future on the other side, people will be like, what about Baroque music? And they're like, well, let's go listen to Bach because he is Baroque. He is the composer. So it's a great example of somebody who, during their lifetime, was not necessarily judged as the preeminent best quality thing available. But as time went on and Bach's fugues, Bach's incredible ability to produce complex counterpoint that was perfectly executed, as that became transmitted from learner to from teacher to learner over and over again, and was played in front of audiences generation after generation, the legend of Bach grew to a point where Bach became the essential Baroque composer and really considered one of the best composers that ever lived. He was absolutely fabulous for what he did and produced a very diverse set of works, considering he worked in the High Baroque. But it's not just that. When Bach was alive, 99% of people never heard his music. And this is something I have to remind people that are like, well, where's today's Mozart? Well, when Mozart was alive, Mozart was like, he was like the Madonna of his age. He was a huge sensation. His operas were selling out all over Europe, and 90% of people in Europe probably never heard Mozart played because of the nature of music. You didn't have this scalable recording medium that let people hear it. So the fame of Mozart grew more in the time that followed his life than it was in his life. Mozart died not a very rich man. He was fairly impoverished when he died. Beethoven was more successful, but that was not entirely due to like some better skill or better business management. But I'll leave that for another video perhaps. But the same idea with Beethoven is that the legend of Beethoven grows after he dies, and only hundreds of years later can we look back at them and say like, well, they were the best. That's the example of the highest level of artistry in music that's possible. And honestly, you can say that about anything from the visual arts, Michelangelo or Leonardo. The fact that Michelangelo, probably most people who were alive at the same time as Michelangelo never saw any of his art, but you have generations and centuries of people coming and seeing his art in religious institutions and museums all over the world, that it becomes this central idea, like who was the great Renaissance artist? It was Michelangelo. And maybe Da Vinci. You have like a limited set of like 3 or 4 guys, and they're all Ninja Turtles, right? So that's the idea. Time is the real filter. So beware comparing contemporary things to those in the past. I mentioned I have a hard time putting new albums on like what are my favorite albums list. And so when I get to that list, there's a couple of albums that are fairly recent, that are only like 3 or 4 years old, and even when I put them on the list, I'm like, I can't put them that high because they haven't been as time tested. They haven't been filtered. They haven't been judged by time as much as they should be. So here's a little piece of advice. How do you use time filtering to your advantage? Last video I made was on noise. Well, the further away you get from news, the more it's filtered by time and the more true it is. So if you're watching a yearly sum up of the most important news, not only are you going to get the stuff that really mattered for the year, you're going to have an accurate reporting of it, a more accurate reporting of it than you get within a 24-hour news cycle where information becomes outdated literally the next day. So if you allow time filtering to deliver you news, you end up with a little bit better accurate idea of what happened in the world. But you can do the same thing with literature. If you read books that remain popular, the older they are and remaining popular, the more likely you are to understand their greatness and to view them as great. You can go read, say, Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. It's a great book for what it is. Now you can understand its flaws from a contemporary perspective because, like, literature has advanced, but the fact that people still read Ivanhoe and understand the story and have a connection with that story, that's a big filtering of time. Same thing with the books by Mark Twain, books by Alexander Dumas, and it's the same thing with Alexander Dumas, or Dumas if I want to drop the S. He wrote like over 100 books with like ghostwriters and stuff, and you still only talk about 4 or 5 of them. So that time filtering is really powerful there. But if you read older stuff, like, why do people read Dostoevsky? It's because it still matters. Like, it still has great content to it, and in 100 years people will probably still be reading it. People still read The Hobbit. In 100 years people will probably still be reading it, and they'll still be reading Lord of the Rings. So if you wanted to get into fantasy, we should start with what has been most filtered by time, which is going to be J.R.R. Tolkien, like Robert E. Howard, Michael Moorcock, those kinds of writers, Ursula Le Guin, the older writers, because you know that those are good because we've had 3, 4, 5, 6 generations of people come through, read the books, pass them on, and think that they're good. So think about that. You can use time filtering to your advantage to find music that's good. The older it is, and if it's still talked about and popular, chances are it's worth listening to, and you're going to enjoy your time doing it. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.